And I'm going to do something else real quick. It's kind of adjusting my angle for my YouTube feed as well. Okay, so again, we're starting with the Cold War. Go back over to this one. All right, so we're going to start this Cold War shortly after World War II. If you remember, World War II came along, and the United States and England were fighting from the west, and Russia, or the Soviet Union, was coming from the east. So we end up with kind of like this. Like Germany was that primary Axis power. Hitler and the Nazis had power, and they kind of spread across Europe, along with help from Italy down in southern Europe. They expand all the way out into the Soviet Union, going as far as Leningrad and Stalingrad along here. And then the Soviet Union has this massive offensive along with this push from the west with England and the United States. So eventually what's going to wind up happening is the Soviet Union, for the most part, is going to have control of all of this purple territory, all this stuff on the map over here. I've got my YouTube account as well. So all this purple territory was under Soviet control. Remember, the Soviet Union was the communist country at that time. None of the other countries around that area were communist yet, but this is going to change a lot. So we go through this communist expansion because now the Soviet Union is going to start establishing these governments that tend to be more communist, even if they weren't communist before. So they have these different ideas about American democracy versus communism, right? First of all, there's kind of logistical reasons why the Soviet Union wants to expand communism. Basically, they have a history of being attacked by the Germans or even the French before that. So by going back to this map again, we can see that these areas that used to be kind of dangerous, areas where they might have been attacked in the past, if you can control those governments or at least have a big say in those governments, then it's pretty likely or very unlikely that you'll ever be attacked again by those countries. So that's going to be a safety measure, right? It makes sense if you're being attacked over and over again from the West that you start to seize control of parts of areas that used to attack you. So on one hand, in that regard at least, really on the other hand, I'm going to shut down my phone. Okay, and it looks like I am getting poor connectivity again, so hopefully I won't lose this. But the other idea is that communism is really kind of a worldwide movement. The whole theory behind Karl Marx's ideologies in the 1840s and 50s was a worldwide communist struggle, right? Workers of the world uniting, taking down these caste institutions and really empowering the working class, regardless of your race or gender, right? Race, ethnicity, and gender don't really matter in communist ideology. It has a lot more to do with basically workers versus these material leaders, these aristocrats or business leaders that control the wealth. They didn't really believe that a select group of people should control the wealth. They believed that wealth should be controlled by the people themselves. So, ultimately what you're going to wind up happening then is you're going to have these people who are very experienced in some very technical fields or very highly educated, really aren't going to do much better than working class who are uneducated financially, because the idea is to kind of share that wealth along, because when it comes down to it, the idea behind communism is that wealth is generated by the workers, right? It doesn't really matter that you have people who are higher educated and higher skilled. Most of the work is done through unskilled labor, and without that unskilled labor that's produced by the masses, you don't have wealth in the first place. So because that unskilled labor is so important to producing wealth, they should get a larger share of the wealth. Right? That's kind of the idea. So in some respects, you'd probably appreciate that, right? Even in today's world, right? The people who tend to be working right now as opposed to sitting at home and trying to work from home. The people that we kind of see as these important workers are people that work in like grocery stores. You don't necessarily have the skills, but it's an important job, and it can be dangerous right now, especially. But that's kind of this idea that these people that are actually working are producing the wealth, and without those workers, you don't go anywhere. So you have to kind of eliminate that aristocracy, right? The people who control the wealth, if you want the workers to really progress. With that aristocracy in place, you're not going to see that equality rise up, because the people who have the wealth are going to basically fund armies, and the armies will protect their wealth. So that's going to be another reason why communism is going to expand, because just in theory, it's going to be there. The United States, on the other hand, and along with England, believed in basically creating democratic governments and avoiding establishing spheres of influence. Right? Spheres of influence are usually equate with Soviet ideas. So we don't want to establish spheres of influence. We want to establish democracies where people can go out and vote. The communists would say that our idea of democracy isn't really democracy, right? And part of the reason I had you guys read those Debs speeches earlier in the semester was because I think he gives a good idea of some of the communist or socialist thinking at the time. Is that democracies in the United States, according to Debs and the Soviet Union and other communist states later to come, isn't really democracy. The reason we say it's not really democracy is because you basically vote for who's on the ballot. And in order to get on the ballot and to get your name really well known, you normally have to have a lot of money, or at least raise a lot of money. So either you have a lot of money or you raise a lot of money. Either way, in order to gain power, you're representing economic interests from the top, not from the bottom. Right? That's going to be the criticism of capitalist democracy, according to the Soviet Union. You saw from Debs and maybe some other people that we've discussed already too. To kind of keep all that in the back of your mind as we move forward. Now, as we get to the end of the war in Europe, so when we get to May of 1945, of course, by that time, Harry S. Truman is president. He's now 4 weeks or maybe about a month into office, and meets with Winston Churchill, like this British prime minister. And Churchill tells Truman that he believed that there had been an iron curtain that had drawn across Eastern Europe, and we cannot see past that iron curtain. We don't know what the Soviet Union is doing back there. Soviet Union is clearly against democratic capitalism. So Churchill expresses this fear that something's going to happen, or this iron curtain is dropped. We can't see past it. We can't get past it. So he expresses those fears. So that's where this term is from Winston Churchill in 1945. Now, there are a number of meetings among Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British leader Winston Churchill, and the United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They're going to meet several times, Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta. Later on in July 45, after Churchill is removed from power and Roosevelt dies, and there'll be another meeting in Potsdam. We're going to see all these different meetings basically trying to create a new world, a new world order, we might say. Part of this is going to be discussing how to defeat German Nazism and defeat the Japanese out in the Pacific, right? Some of that's going to be part of the meetings. When we get over to February 1945, we'll kind of solidify some of these plans. Again, Stalin, Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt meet in Yalta, which is like around the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine. So we're talking about Soviet territory, basically. And they're going to discuss a few things. One thing that we're going to be discussing is this idea of the United Nations. Remember, we had the League of Nations that was established with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And that basically wound up being useless, right? You wouldn't have had a huge, massive World War I. Germany would not have militarized. Japan would not have militarized. You wouldn't have had these various conflicts in the 1930s if the League of Nations was really effective. So basically, we're looking at scrapping the League of Nations and trying to create something like the League of Nations that would join countries together and possibly prevent a future horrific war like World War II, which of course is much worse than World War I. The Soviet Union is going to use leverage, right? Without the Soviet Union, this probably wouldn't work. That's the thinking, because the Soviet Union is starting to become a very big, powerful country, right? Before World War II, they weren't tremendously powerful. They were big, but they weren't tremendously powerful. But they're going to start gaining a lot of power during World War II. And of course, they're gaining land, or at least influence in land, if not the land itself. So they're going to hold a lot of leverage. They're not going to join the United Nations unless they can kind of get their way with a few things. In particular, you're going to see them get their way with getting some land back from Japan that they lost during that Russo-Japanese War around 1904, 1905 timeframe that we covered earlier in the semester. They're also going to say that they come up to an agreement that they'll occupy half of Germany once the war is over. So when we go back over to this map again, essentially you're going to see that purple half of Germany is going to be controlled by the Soviet Union. Poland will be under Soviet control at first, and that's a big sticking point for Franklin D. Roosevelt, is this whole issue of Poland. But Soviet Union says, if you don't allow us to kind of help reshape Poland, not necessarily claim Poland and absorb it, but help reshape Poland, we're not going to join this United Nations organization. So Roosevelt basically says, okay, you can control it for now, as long as you promise to hold free and unfettered elections at some point in the future. Well, Joseph Stalin agreed. He signed documentation and said that, yes, in fact, we will kind of reshape Poland, but in the future we will hold free and unfettered. And this is going to be agreed upon in 1945, and you will not see free and unfettered elections in Poland until 1989. So it'll take 44 years for free and unfettered elections to happen. Basically, Stalin was just lying the whole time. No intention of ever allowing Poland to have a democracy. And of course, even if he did allow Poland to have a democracy, he'd be going against his own better judgment, right? According to these communist theories or ideas of this worldwide expansion. In fact, Stalin, a little bit later on, is even going to say that there will always be war as long as there's democratic capitalist countries. There will always be war. So according to Stalin and some other communist-leaning thinkers, as long as democratic capitalists existed, war will come. Now again, if you go back to Deb's speeches from 1918, 1919 timeframe, when he argued about wars, he argued that the reason you have wars is because you have competition around the world waged by people who have a lot of money. And you have people who have a lot of money, they have a great deal of interest, and there's greed involved. They will fund wars, right? If you don't have money to purchase weapons and prolong a war, you won't have a war in the first place. So basically, capitalist societies are built upon trying to make more money and competing with one another in order to gain power, right? So communist theory is going to say, as long as that exists, you're always going to have a war. So that's also going to play a role in why we see a rise of this Cold War, which leads us up to containment. So when we're talking about containment, we're going to first start off with a guy named George F. Kennan. George F. Kennan was an American diplomat who lived in Moscow for several years. He's intimately, or had very intimate knowledge of how the Soviet government worked. So he'd been there for several years. He knew kind of all the movers and shakers. He knew how politics worked out there. He knew who had power and so forth. And in 1946, Harry S. Truman wanted feedback from Kennan regarding how he believed the United States should handle this whole Soviet situation. So in response, Kennan wrote this 5,000-word telegram. Remember, phones aren't going across the ocean yet. He writes his 5,000-word telegram. We're talking about like a 15 to 20-page document, depending on the size. Actually, there is a copy that you can look at of the long telegram that Kennan wrote, both transcribed into a PDF and then the actual transcription from 1940s. But this is very long telegraph where he gives all these different points about what the Soviet Union was like, what their ideas were, and basically he argued that the Soviet Union is going to build up their military and try to subvert capitalist democracies. He says long term the Soviet Union is going to do this. They're going to build up their military. They have a strong military because of World War II, or thanks in large part to that war. And the United States has a history of building up a military and then shrinking it when they don't need it, right? All the way back to George Washington as our first president, we didn't really believe in big standing armies. Even when we get to Thomas Jefferson, he's going to like really shrink the size of our military. So the United States historically, up until this point, never had a huge military. So Soviet Union is basically banking on that. They're wanting the United States to go back down like we always had in the past. Build up a military when there's a time of war and shrink it when the war is not needed. So if we do what we did historically, the Soviet Union can then expand without worrying about whether or not the United States would get involved, right? England historically has a big military, but their country is nowhere near the size of the Soviet Union. And by the end of World War II, there's two superpowers, Soviet Union and the United States. England would really be no match for the Soviet Union at this point by themselves. So if we shrink our military, England's not going to be able to sustain an attack or a defensive position against the Soviet Union. So Kennan is basically saying the only way we're going to defeat the Soviet Union is basically to maintain a big, strong military and help countries wherever communism starts to spread. So that's going to be this idea of containment. The Soviet Union has already expanded. They already established communism in various other countries, what we're going to call the Eastern Bloc going forward. But we need to stop it from expanding, right? This is this idea, this domino theory idea that we have here on the PowerPoint. We'll talk about this again when we get to Vietnam. We have this domino theory that if one Eastern Bloc country falls, then the next one will also fall. Sorry, I kind of rushed past this Germany. This map that we had here was Germany and Berlin. We'll talk more about Germany and Berlin later on. But you're going to see these other countries out here, like Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these countries out here. You now have communist states established in these territories that didn't have communism before. So the idea is if you allow communism to expand, you're going to see country after country expand with alongside. So basically they'll all fall like dominoes. It's like, they're all kind of linked together. So now we'll get to Greece and Turkey. By the way, actually I'll mention this France in just a little bit when we get to the Marshall Plan. But Greece and Turkey are having their own issues as we get into 1946 and 47 in particular. You're going to see a communist uprising in Greece once we get into late 1946. By that time, England had troops, and they were basically helping Greece try to put down that communist rebellion. But England is really strapped for cash. Remember, they still have this worldwide empire. You're starting to see various countries within the British Empire start to push for decolonization. So England notifies the United States in February of 1947 that they were going to have to give up on Greece. They weren't going to be able to help Greece fight this communist revolt anymore. Turkey is also under threat because the Soviet Union wants to take some of this territory, so they have control through the Black Sea, letting out these Dardanelles and this Turkish channel. They want control of this territory right there. So Turkey's concerned about a Soviet expansion. Greece is concerned about a communist expansion that is being funded by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is supporting this communist effort. They're providing money and weapons to people that are willing to fight against Greece. So with this long telegram in mind, right, with Kennan's idea that we need to continue fighting against the spread of communism, contain it wherever it is, Harry S. Truman delivers this speech, March 12th of 1947, where he tells the American people on radio that we need to support these countries, essentially support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. So essentially the idea is, when we get to Greece and other countries like this, you'll see like maybe 25% of the country is communist. But that 25%, which is a small minority of the country, is going to be heavily armed with a lot of money because the Soviet Union is supporting them. Whereas the other 75% may be suffering financially because of economic conditions. So normally 75% could easily defeat a 25% minority. But not if the 25% minority has weapons and the 75% doesn't. Right? That's the idea. So what we need to do is kind of build up that 75% wherever this may be, support our military, provide them weapons and provide them financial assistance in order to stop the expansion of communism. So this Truman Doctrine is basically going to say we're going to contain communism wherever it is around the world. Now again, this is going to be like wherever it is around the world. This is not going to be we're going to pick and choose spots. This is going to be we're going to make sure that communism doesn't spread at all. So this is going to be a very aggressive containment policy, more aggressive than what Kennan was actually pushing for. Kennan really believed that you should kind of pick and choose where you're containing, kind of think about what countries we should defend and what countries we shouldn't defend. But Truman basically says we're going to stop the expansion of communism altogether. Now, for the most part, this idea of containment is going to stick around for the next 40 years. Right? The fall of communism is going to happen around 1989, 1990 time frame. Really starts in 1989. For this entire time, we're going to kind of use containment. We'll have a little bit of, we're going to back off of this a little bit when we get to Richard Nixon. Of course, when we get to the Vietnam era, we'll talk about that later on. But this will kind of set forth the policy, this diplomatic policy that we'll have for the next 4 decades. Now, there will be criticisms, right? As I mentioned, Kennan wasn't a huge fan of how aggressive this policy was. There are some hardcore conservatives, maybe war hawks, who said that containment isn't good enough. Those countries in Eastern Europe like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, these countries didn't really want communism. It was kind of forced upon them in the first place. So what the more hawkish people are going to say is that we shouldn't just contain it. We need to go in wherever communism is spread and defeat communism there too. So not just containment, but aggressively attack it. Keep in mind, when we're talking about 1947, we're still the only country in the world that has atomic bombs. So that's a big weapon to wield when nobody else has this. So in theory, we could tell Soviet Union, we've got atomic bombs. You saw what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You want that to happen to Moscow too, right? If you don't want us to bomb the heck out of Moscow, then back out of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and all these other places out in Eastern Europe. So that's what these war hawkish people want us to do. They want us to go in there and free these countries that have been taken over by communist rule. The more liberal conservative critics, rather, would make another argument. They would say, why should you enforce containment around the world and basically tell the Soviet Union that we are your enemies? So that's essentially what containment is doing. You are saying that the Soviet Union and their ideology is our enemy. Now, the Soviet Union, as I mentioned earlier, kind of said that we were enemies anyways. Right? They said, or Stalin said, that the world could not have peace as long as capitalism drove economic growth. These critics of Truman would also have to consider that Stalin essentially called us and capitalism the enemy also, right? So that idea, this idea of capitalism is going to be innately contrary to communism, and really they are going to be enemies one way or the other. It just depends on how you handle that relationship. So we have this Truman Doctrine established, and then in June of 1947, and 1947 is going to be a big year when we're talking about the rise of the Cold War. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposes what we call the Marshall Plan. I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention Greece and Turkey. In March of 1947, after England gives up on supporting Greece, Congress voted to spend $400 million to help Greece. So we will help Greece stave off this communist rebellion. So kind of keep that in mind. Right? The Truman Doctrine, this speech, really starts with us supporting Greece and Turkey to make sure the Soviet Union and communism don't spread over those two territories. Now go back to the Marshall Plan. So Secretary of State George C. Marshall basically said, the reason that countries fall to communism is because of bad economies, right? If you have a bad economy and you have a large percentage of people who are suffering economically in a capitalist country, and what's going to wind up happening is they're going to want help from the government. Now, as long as you maintain a capitalist society, the government, in theory, is probably going to help the big companies that provide jobs for individuals, which means the wealthy are going to be helped first, but then the wealthy are supposed to open up opportunities for lower and middle class employees. Of course, those could eventually work their way up to upper class too, in theory at least. So the idea then is to keep countries from being tempted, or keep people in other countries from being tempted to going communist. So Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed that we spend $13 billion, that's billion with a B. He proposed that we spend $13 billion in financial aid to support European countries to really help drive or build up their industrial sector. Again, this would be for capitalist growth, not communist growth, which means that any country that's communist isn't going to take this money. This is going to be something that's going to be taken by Western European countries for the most part, Northern and Western European countries. So Congress at first kind of him and hawed. Right? They didn't want to spend $13 billion. That's a huge amount of money to be spending. I'm going to show some numbers a little bit later on, actually. Let me see if I've got it here. I don't think it's going to be the next slide. I think it'll be a subsequent slide, but let me just, oh, there it is right there. Yeah, you have it. So we'll mention this here. If you look at 1940 alone, we'll come back. In 1940 alone, the United States total spending was about $10 billion. So that $13 billion, kind of put in perspective, is a huge amount of money for the 1940s. Now we'll talk about 1950 in just a little bit. So Congress really didn't want to do this at first because that's a lot of money to spend. But then Czechoslovakia then falls to communism. So let's go back over to this other slide real quick. Czechoslovakia invaded Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia is invaded, and when Czechoslovakia falls to communist coup in February of 1948, Congress said, maybe that's not such a bad idea. So right after that, Congress votes to approve this Marshall Plan, creating what we call the Economic Cooperation Administration. So we're going to spend or funnel $13 billion of American aid into European countries between 1948 and 1951. By the end of 1950, European industrial production had risen 64%, while industrial production in communist countries actually declined. So these European countries that accepted our aid are going to grow tremendously in a very brief period of time, providing a lot more jobs and better paying jobs, really fixing a lot of their economies. In fact, by 1951, European industrial production was 40% higher than it was before the war. So you see this huge jump, right? Not only did we bring them back to pre-war conditions, which of course was still during the Great Depression, we've increased their production by 40%, or at least thanks in large part to our money that we spent. Marshall winds up winning, or is awarded, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953 as a result of this fantastic economic growth in Europe. The Marshall Plan is regarded as one of our greatest diplomatic plans in U.S. history. So just kind of keep that in mind. Understand what the Marshall Plan was, right? $13 billion into European countries. European countries take that money, they invest in industrial output, provide more jobs, build up their economies, and boom, those countries that took that money are going to be safe from communism, because people aren't going to want to see their country fall to communism if they have good paying jobs and opportunities that and more opportunities that come along. So the Marshall Plan winds up being praised roundly for years to come, even, of course, even today, right? Now we're on the National Security Act of 1947. Again, as I mentioned, that's a big year. The 1947 National Security Act would give more power to the United States President to pursue international goals. So we get rid of the Department of War. Like historically, we had a Department of War, but the Department of War is really kind of in play when you go to war. And if you only go to war every 10, 15, 20 years, however often you go, it's not going to be that significant of a department. But you can always be on the defense, right? You're always looking out for potential wars. So we create the Department of Defense with the National Security Act of 1947. This will incorporate also this Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we're going to create a Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff would oversee the three branches of the United States military, three branches being Army, Navy, and this newly created Air Force, because we've now created the Air Force. Of course, the Marine Corps was within the Department of the Navy. The Coast Guard was, at that time, I believe, under the United States Treasury Department. So we create this Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to oversee the Army, Navy, and Air Force. We're going to create this National Security Council. That's going to give advice or advise the president and govern foreign and military policy from the White House. So basically, you'll have the National Security Council meet with the president regularly, if not daily, and let him know what's going on around the world, what issues could potentially come up, and what issues are going on right now. So now we're going to have people who are going to be invested around the world, trying to figure out what other countries are doing and what potential problems may arise. We also see the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Right? This is all created with the National Security Act of 1947. So the CIA is going to be created to collect information around the world where we could see possible threats or problems. And shortly after this, we'll start engaging in covert military action along with political operations in other countries. So we're going to start undermining other countries, sending in CIA covert agents, sometimes support rebellious movements, stuff like that. So this is going to be a very secretive organization. That's what they're really built upon, is secrets. So we just see this huge expansion. Right? Up until World War II, the United States tended to be a very isolationist country. Not anymore. From this point forward, now the United States can be involved everywhere around the world, because anywhere around the world, especially in this age where you have two superpowers, the Soviet Union that wants to expand their communist theories and ideology, in the United States with our democratic capitalism. Anywhere around the world where we see democratic capitalism or U.S. interest under threat, we are going to be aware of it. in theory at least. But that's going to cost a lot of money, right? We're really going to grow the United States government. So I have to have two little charts, like 1940 spending and 1950 spending. And you can see total spending in 1940 was a little over $10 billion. Spending in 1950 had quadrupled, right? You get up to almost $45 billion. You see a growth of about $34.7 billion in spending between 1940 and 1950. I use those 2 years specifically because 1940 was before we were directly involved in World War II. 1950, we're going to be involved for the second half of the year in Korea, but most of the planning for the spending isn't going to be around just yet. So that war will go from 50 to 53 that we'll talk about later on. So we see this huge spending, right? $34 billion plus, and you can see specifically how much money we're spending on defense, right? $24 billion by the time you get to 1950. If you look at 1940, it was $2 billion, right? So we see this huge military growth as part of the increased spending. Now you'll see other things like education and welfare. Those are going to also grow tremendously between 1940 and 1950, not nearly as much as what defense did. And we're going to talk about why that is in a little bit when we get a little bit further into Truman. Let's move on to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO will be created in the midst of this Berlin airlift. So we'll talk about that first. Now remember, Berlin was in West Germany. So I'm going to put this up real quick, go over here, and actually, okay, so we go back to this map over here, right? What you see on the left is a map of Germany itself. What you see on the right is a map of Berlin. So Berlin, right here, go over here, I'm trying to pull up my YouTube one too. Berlin is inside of East Germany. Right? That's what this map is looking at this main city or capital city of Germany, which was in East Germany, which was under Soviet control. In that Yalta conference, the Soviet Union agreed to allow England, France, United States to jointly occupy Berlin following World War II, which is why those three countries, like France, England, or United Kingdom, and the United States are all there. Now, eventually, France, England, and the United States are going to join their three partitions together, while the Soviet Union will keep that Eastern Germany. But the Soviet Union really wants us, England and France also, out of Berlin altogether because Berlin was in East Germany. Truman does not want to give up on Berlin, rather, because it goes contrary to these ideas of containment, right? And again, this idea that you need to stop communist expansion wherever it is. So we will not allow West Berlin to fall to Soviet control. But we do need to provide supplies for the people in West Berlin. Now, again, going through the 1940s, the main way you travel and transport goods is going to be on roads and railways, mainly trains. What the Soviet Union does is they issue this blockade in June of 1948. They put a blockade in place to make sure that the United States or anybody else could not bring provisions to West Berlin. So they're basically trying to starve out West Berlin, keep any supplies out of there, and basically tell the people in West Berlin, if you want help, you're going to have to come to our side. Right? You're going to have to push for Soviet control, since England, France, and the United States aren't going to be able to take care of it. That's what he's trying to do in June 1948. But Truman says, no, we're not going to give up. So he starts airlifting goods. By the time we get to September of 1948, we're going to be delivering about 7,000 tons of food, fuel, medicine, coal, and other equipment on a daily basis. So we're talking about 14 million pounds of goods are delivered on a daily basis through air traffic. So about every 4 minutes or so, on average, we're landing a new plane in West Berlin, bringing in more goods to help the people of West Berlin survive this blockade. We're going to do that all the way from June of 1948 to May of 1949. So for what 10 and a half months, we have this. For 10 and a half months, we're airlifting all of these supplies to Berlin. Stalin is hoping and planning on us giving up, but we never do. In fact, April 15 to April 16 of 1949, over about a 24-hour period of time, we established this Easter parade. It's going to be American planes bringing in new goods every minute. So every 62 seconds, we deliver a new plane with more goods. Altogether, we're going to deliver like 13,000 tons of coal plus other goods to help West Berlin. So basically, we're telling Stalin we're never going to give up. Right? No matter how hard you try to keep West Berlin from being under our control, we're going to keep doing it. Shortly after that shortly after that Easter parade, Stalin, about 4 weeks later, about a month later maybe, he decides to go ahead and just give up on it. So now we can start using roads and railways again. So this Berlin airlift winds up being successful for Truman if this goal was to protect and keep West Berlin under Allied control and away from Soviet control. Now NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established April 4th of 1949, again, just before that Easter parade. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will be a defense agreement or defense pact that calls for an alliance against a Soviet intrusion. So if the Soviet Union bombs England, we would say that they're bombing us too. So if anybody is attacked by the Soviet Union, we would see that attack as being on us also, which means that they bomb England, we're going to bomb the Soviet Union. Now, if they bomb France, we're going to bomb France. We're going to bomb the Soviet Union. And same thing. If the Soviet Union attacks us, then England, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and all these other countries are going to jump in on our side. So basically, we're telling the Soviet Union that we are all in it together, and we will not allow them to attack any one of us. It'll be fighting all of us. Now, the Soviet Union will wind up creating this Warsaw Pact. We're not going to talk about that. They'll basically create a counter group that does kind of the same thing as NATO, but from their perspective. Now we'll move on to Israel. Now, Israel was established as a nation state in May of 1948, but I'll give you a little bit of background. Now, if we go back to World War I, right, this whole Middle Eastern territory was under Ottoman control, right? Most of it was under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was on the same side as Germany and Austria-Hungary. So when the Ottoman Empire lost with the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to break up that Ottoman Empire. We're going to create all these little countries, right? Countries like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan or Transjordan, Palestine, right? All these different countries are going to be created from what used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And then various countries, mainly England and France, will be given like mandates, basically help those countries kind of build themselves back up over the next 30 years, and at some point give them their independence. So England had control of Palestine. So this little purple strip right over here is what we're looking at. So England had control of that. Now, Palestine is where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is a holy city to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Now, you do have all three of those people there, especially as we get into the early 1900s. But there was a small remnant of Jews in Palestine before the 1900s. But in the early 1900s, we're going to see the kind of this Zionist movement. So a lot of Jews are suffering in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia, Soviet Union, Russia, this Poland area. So they're suffering, so they start moving down to Palestine, their ancient homeland. And they start building up these Jewish communities in Palestine. As we get into 1917, during World War I, England starts sending political leaders in. The Ottoman Empire is pretty much kind of gone. It's really mainly against Germany by that time. And in 1917, there's something called the Balfour Declaration. You don't necessarily have to know the Balfour Declaration or Balfour Plan of 1917, but basically, this foreign minister from England writes a letter to this wealthy banker saying that there should be a homeland for Jewish people in Palestine. Now, it doesn't say we should give them an independent country. It basically just says that we should find a place in Palestine where Jewish people should be free to settle and basically feel safe. That's the idea behind this Jewish homeland in 1917. Now, by 1919, the war is over. England gets control of Palestine with this mandate, and more Jews start moving into Palestine, especially in the 1930s and 1940s when Nazis started putting Jews in concentration camps. So we now have a substantial Jewish population in Palestine by the time we get to the end of World War II. And now we have the United Nations established just after World War II, or at least after the war in Europe. And the United Nations comes up with a plan in late 1947. So in November of 1947, we see this plan established by the United Nations, which would give Israeli land over here. So all this yellow territory, all of that yellow territory is designated as Israel land, or basically Jewish land. The green territory was established as Palestinian land, mainly Arab with some Christian. So now we have Lebanon, or Palestine, carved up by the United Nations. Of course, the Arabs who lived in Palestine were not happy about this, so they immediately, at least by January of 1948, they start attacking Jews, even though Israel was not a nation state yet. They start attacking the Jewish people in January 1947, up to 48 rather. They start killing a bunch of them. Nevertheless, the United Nations proceeded with this plan. Now, May 14th of 1948, that mandate that was established for England to have control over Palestine, that expired. So England, as of May 14th, 1948, no longer has legal control of Palestine. The United Nations has already established that yellow territory that I showed in the previous map to the Jewish people. And the main leader of the Jewish people in Israel by that time was a guy named David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was the Jewish leader. Really, he was the main guy in charge from 1935 all the way up until 1963. He was part of that Zionist movement of the early 1900s. So David Ben-Gurion, this Jewish leader, on May 14th, 1948, when England releases that mandate, he declares Israel to be an independent country. Now remember, when the United Nations created this land for the Jewish people of Israel, it wasn't necessarily as an independent country. It's a land where Jewish people should be safe. So after declaring this an independent country, the United States and the Soviet Union immediately recognized the independence of Israel as a nation state. And the next day, I think it was 5 countries. Let me make sure I've got those numbers correct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next day, so I'm going to go back to this map again. Keep going to the wrong one. There we go. The next day, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt all attacked. So 5 countries, in addition to Palestinians that were already in place, all declared war on Israel. They attacked Israel, trying to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. But Israel winds up winning this war. Even though they're being attacked by 5 countries, they wind up winning the war by the following year. So in 1949, as a result of this war, Israel gained more land. So you can see this 1949 and 1967 map. You can see more land now under Israeli control as a result of this attack on them the day after they declared independence. You'll see in 1967, we'll talk about the 1967 war later, and something called the Yom Kippur War after that. So we'll talk about a couple of more issues and kind of keep track of what's going on in the Middle East. Pretty good chance when we get to the final exam, you'll see a question, or you may see a question regarding United States and Middle East issues from World War II up until the 1990s, early 2000s, depending on how far we go. So kind of keep track of what's going on with Israel. And now that we recognize Israel as an independent nation state, according to the original plan drafted by the United Nations. Now, we'll just quickly mention that in 1946, the United States government created the Atomic Energy Commission. Basically, we want to build bigger, better, more powerful atomic bombs. And by 1952, we create or develop this hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb that we tested in 1952 was 450 times more powerful than the bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. And remember, that bomb killed 100,000 people right off the bat, not counting the nuclear fallout afterwards. So now we have a bomb that's much, much more powerful than that bomb in 1952. Now, I will mention that in 1949, the Soviet Union has now developed their own atomic bombs. Again, not nearly as strong as our hydrogen bomb yet, but they do have atomic bombs by 1949. That will play a role in this Red Scare that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Now, we'll mention Harry S. Truman real quick. Now, Harry S. Truman, of course, became president after Franklin D. Roosevelt died in April of 1945. Now, by early 1948, Harry S. Truman is going to deliver this State of the Union address where he proposes what we're going to call the Fair Deal. He doesn't call it the Fair Deal right off the bat, but we're going to wind up calling it the Fair Deal. Essentially, what this is going to be, it's going to be an expansion on the New Deal. So he liked the New Deal, but he didn't think the New Deal was big enough. He kind of thought the New Deal was kind of a starting point for what could wind up being a bigger, better America. And of course, this will increase the size of the federal government. So he comes up with the Fair Deal. Now, I'll give you a few points to kind of keep track of some of these on what the Fair Deal encompassed. Now, bear in mind, most of this will not be successful in 1948. You could argue that Truman was far ahead of his time in some of these issues. But first of all, the main thing that Truman said in this speech is that he wanted civil rights for everyone. So in 1948, Harry S. Truman is saying that we should have civil rights legislation and civil rights should be protected for every American in the country. So he is very much for civil rights. Again, we will not have significant civil rights legislation until we get to the mid-1960s. So he's doing this about a decade and a half, maybe a little bit more than that, before we're going to see that significant legislation come. Right? Congress isn't going to want to pass this civil rights legislation, but that's going to be what thing that he wants. He also wanted to increase federal aid to education. We do that a little bit, right? I showed you on that previous slide that education spending did go up, so that's part of that fair deal. Spend more money in education, but it's not a huge increase. The huge increase will come later on in the 1960s when we get to LBJ. President Lyndon B. Johnson comes in the 1960s, then education will become a bigger issue. So civil rights, he wants more money spent on education. He also wanted to expand unemployment and retirement benefits. So we're going to expand Social Security under Truman. So when I showed you the other slide and I showed that welfare, Social Security is considered a part of the welfare spending. That will increase a little bit. Again, it'll go up even more as we go in the 1960s. Truman also wanted to create a nationalized health insurance. So he's pushing for nationalized health insurance in 1948. Now, we don't have Medicare yet. Again, Medicare will come along under President Lyndon B. Johnson. And then, of course, we'll have Obamacare established, what, 60-something years, what, 62, 63 years after this happens, right? After Harry S. Truman. So he's way ahead of his time. We're talking about nationalized health insurance. So that's not going to happen under Truman, of course. He will also push for an increase in the minimum wage. So he wants the minimum wage to increase. That will happen under Truman's watch. So while he's president, the national minimum wage will go from 40 cents per hour to 75 cents per hour. So it almost doubled, going from 40 cents per hour to 75 cents per hour. So we do see a sizable increase in the national minimum wage. And then the last thing I'll mention is that he wanted more rural people to have access to electricity. That will happen. It was happening anyways. So he's just saying, yeah, we want to keep that going. So that part's not quite as big as some of these other issues that are part of Fair Deal. But again, most of it's not going to really see a lot of success. The success he had was fairly limited because Congress, again, has to pass the legislation. And the Republican Congress that's going to rise up in the late 1940s is going to butt heads with Truman quite a bit. So when we get to this 1948 presidential election, number 48, he delivers this in his State of the Union address. A lot of Democrats aren't going to be real happy with Truman. Remember, Harry S. Truman was a Democrat. So, and if you recall, the South, at least Southern whites, tended to be Democrats also, like going all the way back to the Civil War. Southerners were Democrats, Northerners were Republicans at that time for the most part. Now we're going to start seeing that change because those Southern whites that have been Democrats their whole life aren't going to be huge fans of Harry S. Truman, right? Truman is now saying he wants civil rights for all people. So people in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, right? They're not going to be huge fans of a president who's a Democrat saying, I want civil rights legislation. So that's going to cause problems. In fact, the Democratic Party is going to wind up splitting. So Truman will be selected as the Democratic Party candidate, but Southerners don't want to vote for Truman. They also aren't a big fan of the Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey. So they split the Democratic Party. In July of 1948, they create the States' Rights Democratic Party, what we call Dixiecrats. So make sure you know the Dixiecrats are going to be basically Southern Democrats who don't want Truman mainly because of this issue regarding civil rights. And they'll nominate a guy named Strom Thurmond from South Carolina to be their presidential candidate. Now later on, Strom Thurmond will become, at that point, let me say that first. At that point, Strom Thurmond was the South Carolina governor. But later on, Thurmond will serve as a senator from South Carolina for almost 50 years, from 1956 all the way to 2003 when he died. He was a senator from South Carolina. But Thurmond would be your Southern Democratic candidate. Now, this could cause problems for the Democratic Party, right? We have a history of parties being split with an election before. We covered one of them in this class already, right? 1912, you had Woodrow Wilson as the Democrat. You had Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, who were both Republicans. And because, thanks in large part to the Republican Party being split between Taft and Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson winds up winning the election, right? Same thing happened in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican, ran against Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas. Douglas, the Northern Democrat. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. Those two basically canceled each other out, which allowed Lincoln to win the election, right? So normally, when you see a major political party split like this, the other party winds up winning, which is why you're going to see a newspaper in Chicago published saying Dewey defeats Truman. I added this 1948 election. This was the various polls before the election. You can see that all three of the polls had Dewey winning between 50 and 53% of the vote. Truman taking anywhere from 38 to 45% of the vote. Now, the actual election results, we saw Truman win. Truman winds up taking this, he campaigns across the country, going train stop to train stop, speaking to thousands upon thousands of people. And what winds up happening is he winds up getting a lot of black voters. We see a record number of African-American voters who vote for Truman. And a lot of times those polls don't account for every type of person. Right? So a lot of times the polling aren't going to include African-Americans if the African-American community doesn't have a history of voting regularly. And that's basically what happens. When they're polling, they're not polling a lot of the African-American people, and a lot of those African-American people, by a large margin, vote for Truman because Truman is offering to push for civil rights legislation. So Truman winds up winning the election, taking over 300 electoral votes, right? It wasn't even that close. When you look at the electoral vote count, 303 to 189, you see Strom Thurmond, as kind of a third-party candidate, winds up winning South Carolina, his home state, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, right? But this is a huge upset. The fact that Truman was able to win the 48 election despite the fact that he was in a split party. So now we'll move on to Asia. So we're going to go on to China first. Now remember, China, we had a history of China, in China. We went back to the open door votes with John Hay back around the turn of the century under McKinley and later Roosevelt. We'd established businesses in China. And the guy that we were supporting and was supporting the United States for the most part was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek was the Chinese leader that we wanted to be in charge, mainly because he was very anti-communist. But he was kind of reputed to be corrupt, maybe incompetent, and not very popular in China amongst the masses, especially the people out of the countryside. So rural China didn't like Chiang Kai-shek because Chiang Kai-shek is basically very much pro-business and had a reputation of being corrupt. So what's going to wind up happening is another guy named Mao Zedong is going to lead this communist revolt. He'll get a lot of people from the countryside who are suffering under Chiang Kai-shek's leadership to join his side. And by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek will basically create a government in Formosa, which we now know as Taiwan. So Chiang Kai-shek leaves China in 1949, which means Mao Zedong and the communist Chinese government is now established. We will not recognize Mao's government in 1949. In fact, according to the United States, China is just a tiny little island off the coast of mainland China. So for the next 20-something years, going on 30 years, China to us is actually Taiwan, not Mao Zedong's or Mao's government in mainland China. But that basically meant we lost a big ally in Southeastern Asia. So now we need somebody else out in Eastern or Southeastern Asia, Eastern Asia in this case, to be an ally. And then we turn to Japan. Remember, Japan was our enemy during World War II, but after the war's over, after we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and they gave up in August 1945, Douglas MacArthur and American forces go into Japan. MacArthur becomes supreme commander in Japan. Basically, he's like just a step below the emperor of Japan. So he has a lot of power and a lot of respect in Japan. While we're in Japan, we're going to help create a new constitution. We will weaken the military and strengthen parliament. So we're going to make Japan basically more of a democratic style country, and we will give women the right to vote. Before we were there, women did not have the right to vote in Japan, but we're going to draft a new constitution which will give women the right to vote, and it will outlaw racial discrimination in Japan. Again, we have not necessarily outlawed racial discrimination in the United States, but in Japan, we outlaw racial discrimination while we're there. So we're going to start rebuilding Japan. By the 1970s, Japan will become an economic powerhouse. But we're going to start building Japan back up. Now, while this is all going on, or right after this Japanese issue starts, then we see a war in Korea. Now, I could go on in more detail, but we're just going to briefly say that Korea was occupied initially by both Soviet forces and American forces. You have this 38 dotted line or serrated line right here. Anything north of that 38th parallel was under Soviet control following World War II. Remember, Korea used to be under Japanese control. So we take Korea away from Japan. We occupy southern Korea. The Soviet Union occupies northern Korea, and we're going to start building them back up. Of course, the Soviet Union is going to establish a sphere of influence. Right? They're going to establish a communist government in North Korea. They're going to provide a lot of military goods, some very sophisticated and expensive weapons. While the United States isn't so concerned with building a military powerhouse in South Korea, we really just wanted to build more of a democratic capitalist country that we could trade with, not necessarily one that's going to be a great fighting country. So we abandon, or both the Soviet Union and the United States leave North and South Korea in 1949, and in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea in order to try to bring all of Korea under one government and expand communism. Like we'll be doing two things, both reuniting all of Korea and two, expanding communism. Now, as you can see from this map, North Korea really pushes back really hard. So it looks like it's almost done, but MacArthur goes to Korea, and we're going to push back. So by the time we get to November of 1950, MacArthur, who's leading UN forces, mostly American forces, gets up to this dotted line or serrated line right up here. So we've almost won it by November of 1950. At that point, China, which is under a communist government, decides they're going to throw very active support to North Korea. They want to make sure that North Korea defeats American and UN forces. And you're going to wind up seeing hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops drop in. So essentially what's going to wind up happening is this war is mainly going to be American forces versus Chinese forces, but in Korean territory. Now, MacArthur is our general, and MacArthur really, well, he goes to Truman and tells Truman, if China's fighting against us, we should be fighting in Korea, we should be fighting in China. We have atomic bombs, they do not. So MacArthur tells Truman that he believed that we should wage war on China, expand the war to the country that's actually fighting against us, not just North Korea, because as we take the war to China, it's a pretty good chance they'll give up, especially if we start dropping atomic bombs on them. But Truman did not want to expand the war. So because he didn't want to expand the war, MacArthur is frustrated and infuriated with Truman, feels like Truman is doing a terrible job of managing the war. So MacArthur winds up writing a letter to a congressman, and in this letter, he basically had some bad, insubordinate things to say about Truman. Basically said that Truman was an idiot. So when word gets out that Douglas MacArthur said some bad things about Truman, Truman then relieves MacArthur of his command and replaces him. Now, ultimately, what's going to wind up happening is we're going to have they'll end with agreements. They'll create a partition right along that 38th parallel. So basically, you have about 3 years worth of fighting. Altogether, you're going to have somewhere around, I'm trying to get these numbers real quick, 1.8. Over 2 million people are going to die between 1950 and 1953, including about 40,000 Americans, and including about 600,000 Chinese soldiers. So 600,000 Chinese soldiers die in the Korean War versus 40,000 American soldiers. So that just shows how many Chinese soldiers are being sent into action at this point. But we wind up having this war end basically where it started. Now we'll move on to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Let me see here real quick, just in the interest of my YouTube video. Okay. Now, I'll play this YouTube video and I'll play it on their computer. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. We're going to see a group called the House Un-American Activities Committee rise up in Congress. Let me go back here. Now, that's actually been there since the late 1930s. It rose up in Congress, led by Republicans who thought that Franklin D. Roosevelt was allowing communist subversion to enter the U.S. government in the late 1930s. So we see this House American Activities Committee created basically to protect from communism. It's kind of dies down again in the 1940s during World War II, and it rises back up again when it's around 1947, 1948 timeframe. So beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee in the United States Congress starts inviting people or asking people, or really more telling people, come speak to Congress because we think you're a communist. So since we think you're a communist, we want you to speak to us and start listing names of other communists that we can bring. And then we can kind of keep an eye on you and maybe blacklist you or something else like that. Now, you really have to kind of play along, because if you don't play along, then it's not going to go very well for you. You cannot plead the fifth, right? You cannot refuse to answer questions that you believe may self-incriminate. If you do, you'll be found guilty of contempt of Congress, which means you could get a $1,000 fine and spend a year in jail. Now, the House Un-American Activities Committee is going to focus first off on the Hollywood film industry. They believe that the Hollywood film industry is tainted with communism, and they're spreading communist propaganda. So they invite people from the Hollywood film industry, and that's what this video is going to be. So I'm going to share my video with you in just a minute. I'm going to try to time this so that my YouTubers can see it also while you guys are seeing it. So take a look at the talent. Let's see. And, oops, forgot. I need to share my screen with you guys first, don't I? Let me go back over here real quick. Okay, and I hope you guys can see this. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, would somebody turn on their mic real quick? Because I can't see my screen. Somebody turn on your mic real quick and tell me if you can see my Hollywood 10 film with Screencast-O-Matic on your screen.
So far, I just see the red scare slide and the description, or not the description, but just Hollywood 10, Alger Hiss,
Okay.
Whitaker, Chambers, and Richard Nixon.
Okay, let me try this again. There we go. Okay. See my Screencast-O-Matic? Just somebody chime in if you don't mind.
So yeah, it's now showing a Screencast-O-Matic, and there's a YouTube
Okay,
video.
perfect. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and play this, and I'll time it sometime. Okay, here we go.
At home, Americans feared red subversion. Congress revived the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1947, the committee investigated Hollywood, factory of America's imagination.
Ever observed any communistic information in any script? Well, I have turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. They haven't attempted to use me, I don't think, because apparently They know that I'm not very sympathetic to communism. There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild board and officers or the Guild itself as evidenced by the vote on various issues. That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
10 witnesses, the Hollywood 10, defied the committee's right to ask about their beliefs.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of American.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his absolutely invasive.
Then you denied, you refused to answer that. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I
Stand away from the stand.
For the Bill of Rights, which
Stand away from the stand.
Others from the film industry demonstrated their support.
Online, because you guys are watching in Blackboard Collaborate. I really couldn't see it very well. Now I know it's 10:51, so I'm going to cut this down in just a minute. We'll just mention real quick. I'll go back over here. Just trying to put this nice thing. I'm going to go for maybe like 3 more minutes or so, and then we'll finish off the Cold War with the rise of Eisenhower, the Eisenhower era. So let me just make sure I've got the right page back in front of me. So we have this Hollywood 10 film industry. Again, 10 members of the Hollywood film industry refused to answer questions. They basically said, hey, my beliefs are my beliefs. My party affiliation is my party affiliation. There's nothing in the Constitution saying I can't be a communist. In fact, it says quite the opposite. I'm not doing anything to hurt the country. But the United States government Congress is going to investigate, trying to find out what communist subversion may exist. And one of those, actually a ton of those Hollywood members of the film industry wound up going to prison, get the $1,000 fine. One, a guy named Edward Dmytryk, actually changed his mind while he was in prison, gave names, and basically went back to work. So all these Hollywood 10 were blacklisted. So let's see, I think that should be about it. We'll pick up the His Chambers case next class. So I'll go and let you guys go. So if you have an 11 o'clock class, you can move on to the next class now and not miss anything. But we'll end the recording here, and I guess I'll see you guys later. Next Tuesday, again, we'll have our next live lecture. We'll finish the rise of the Cold War and the Eisenhower era, and again, we'll have the quiz after that class. All right, take care. You guys have a great day.